Hi, Sami, and welcome.
Thanks.
Instantly, when I saw your academic disassociation, I had to have you as a guest here. But before we move on to that, could you give a short presentation about yourself?
Well, thanks for reminding me. So I'm Sami Geneidy. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland. I work at the School of Business and Economics and the School of Resource Wisdom. I guess we're going to go more deeply into my research topic, but just very briefly, I'm basically working with biodiversity footprint assessment of companies and also with carbon footprint assessment and environmental accounting in general. And I've been thinking a little bit about how to integrate environmental and financial accounting together in my research as well.
Okay. And if we go back to your academic dissertation, it was called Integrating Financial, Carbon, and Biodiversity Footprint Accounting in Organizations. So what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I guess you'd have to read the 100 pages. No, it's basically what it means is that, well, first of all, we have these different kind of accounting systems in companies, in different organizations. We want to measure the impact on climate, so we need to measure the carbon footprint that we have. Then a new emerging concept called the biodiversity footprint is coming up. So we also want to measure our impact on nature and on biodiversity. And finally, why I'm also talking about financial accounting is that we have sort of kept these environmental things kind of at the side and as a separate thing in organizations. And what I'm sort of calling for in the dissertation is a stronger merge and a stronger interaction between the financial operations of an organization with the sort of environmental side, which is the carbon and biodiversity footprint accounting. So hence integrating all these different accounting systems together.
So what was environmental, biodiversity, and financial accounting?
Yeah, basically dealing a lot with carbon and biodiversity footprint accounting, but environmental accounting sort of as a term encompasses all kinds of environmental aspects, whether it's climate or biodiversity or whatever.
And in the future, it'll be a natural aspect that it's just a financial accounting, and it always has environmental aspects in them. That's the end goal.
I think that would be the end goal. So we need to reach a point where our financial operations are influenced by those environmental accounts. So basically, for example, we need to have price on our carbon footprint. We need to have price on our biodiversity footprint, because in the current, at least, society and the current operation models of companies and organizations operate through the financial reality and sort of the financial accounts and the reports. They basically create the reality and the boundaries that we operate within. While we can, of course, we can sort of argue that reality is constructed by us, so we can actually change it. We can change the way how we do financial accounting. We can change the way how we report about things. We can, I dare say, even change about how we think about profit, how we think about loss, and those kind of sort of very basic concepts in companies' financial operations. Then again, even though they are sort of basic and given, they are not sort of natural laws, so we can merge, we can change them. And what I think we should do is we need to change them based on what is our environmental impact.
So what does that, like, in an example mean? Like, if I'm a company, what should I be doing? I've been starting to report my emissions. I know my financial aspects of my business. What else?
Well, first of all, I think a major thing is that a lot of companies are now basically reporting and assessing their carbon footprints and their emissions, but what has been left at the sideline is basically to look at it more holistically. So what is our impact on nature? And Now that's one very sort of key important issue. These intergovernmental panels, science panels on climate change and biodiversity, they have basically issued this sort of joint statement where it says that we cannot just look at climate change and leave out biodiversity and biodiversity loss, but we have to look at them at the same time. If we think that we can first solve this one issue and then move on to the other one, we will fail at sort of achieving a solution for both of them. So we have to look at them at the same time. So that's the first thing I would say. And then, yeah, so go ahead.
Sorry, could you specify what do you mean by the word loss of biodiversity?
Yeah, sure. So basically, if we first think about a little bit, what is biodiversity? It might seem quite a sort of intangible concept as it is. There are basically different definitions. So we have different kinds of species. It's a diversity of the different species, the different ecosystems, even a diversity of our genes in different environments. But it doesn't have to be so complicated. So we can actually also say that it's just the diversity of life. So biodiversity is just all the life we have on this planet. And when we talk about biodiversity loss, it is the protection of that life. And more specifically, biodiversity loss is directly driven by 5 key human activities. So we have land and sea use, we have the direct exploitation of natural resources, we have climate change. So climate change and biodiversity loss are very deeply interconnected. Then we have pollution, and finally we have invasive alien species. So these are basically the 5 key things that drive biodiversity loss due to human activities and cause them the deterioration of life on Earth. That's how it is.
Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
So if we go back to an example like in your academic dissertation, could you give examples of what you found out, what you did, and what were the key learnings from that?
Sure. Well, basically, if I start from the basically main articles of the dissertation, so I've been first assessing the carbon footprint of different organizations, and there actually I assessed basically the carbon footprint, for example, for a multinational organization operating in Europe with different offices in different countries. And I think one of the key learnings from there was that travel had a surprisingly intensive carbon footprint for the whole organization. So basically, we talk about flights. So flights had a very important role in the carbon footprint of the organization. And what we sort of did there then was sort of strategies, ways how to mitigate that carbon footprint of the travel and other categories. And I guess we can discuss about those if there's interest. But then the other key learnings, well, the second one I would say that besides sort of producing that sort of knowledge about what a carbon footprint is and what kind of carbon footprints different organizations can have, we produced then the biodiversity footprint. So we actually developed a new methodology in how to assess the biodiversity impact of organizations. And basically the assessment works in a very similar way to these sort of climate impact assessments. So we get a number of results out and it tells us, okay, where is your major biodiversity footprint coming from? And we tested this assessment with our own university and have now tested it with numerous other companies in Finland, for example, the S group here. And yeah, maybe the third key learning then was the sort of fact that just producing these assessments and the results and making this knowledge available, it seems that it's not enough. So we have had knowledge about different environmental and sustainability issues in general, but we haven't been able to make the necessary changes yet, even though we are going to the right direction in many ways, but with not enough speed maybe. And the issue there that I highlight then is that, yes, maybe we should look at integrating these issues more thoroughly into the financial operating systems of organizations.
So how does a company measure their biodiversity footprint?
Yeah, so basically there are 4 key steps. So first of all, if I'm a company, I need to understand what are my activities. So basically, what am I consuming? What am I producing? Whether it's euros of a product or service, kilograms of materials or kilograms of food, or megawatt hours of certain types of energy, or those kind of things. So I need to first understand what are the key activities in my operations. The second step is to understand how much those key activities basically produce the different drivers of biodiversity loss. So if you remember these 5 key drivers, we have to, for example, understand that, okay, if my company uses or buys 100 laptops, how much land use, how much pollution, or how much carbon footprint does it cause in the value chain of producing that laptop, for example. The third step then in this biodiversity footprint assessment is that we need to understand where the impact took place. Nature is different, for example, in Finland than it is in China or in Brazil. So we need to sort of understand where the impact happens. Final step is that we need to convert all this information to the biodiversity loss in that specific location caused by that specific driver of biodiversity loss. So for example, in the case of these laptops, we want to understand, okay, that how much land use or pollution is caused in the supply chain of that laptop, in which locations do the pressures take place, and how much sort of harm it causes to nature. And we have it might be a little bit complicated, but we basically have different scientific databases and scientific knowledge which we can sort of synthesize, and we are able to produce all this information. So not all of it has to come from the company itself, but we can actually use different kind of models and databases in understanding the impact.
That sounds a bit next level compared to just counting your emissions.
Well, it sort of is. Then again, there are a lot of similarities. So I think the sort of only next level is that we go beyond just measuring the emissions, which actually, if you think about it, many organizations, they do not only measure the emissions, they try to understand what is a good level of emissions. So where should we head towards, right? So if I tell you that, okay, I made 1,000 kilograms of CO2, you don't know, like, what does it mean? You have to have some sort of reference points or something. And I think the same goes for biodiversity footprints. What we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the meaning to those kilograms of CO2. The next step that is taken there is that we assess what is the impact of those kilograms of CO2 emitted to nature. And that's the real response that we want to look at. So what kind of impact does climate change actually have in our environment?
That was a great quote. I'll have to take that up. Okay, and now when you did the assessment regarding the biodiversity footprint, what kind of effects did it have on the financial accounting?
Yeah, well, we basically then tested how we could sort of value the biodiversity footprint. And what we did is we basically assigned this sort of offsetting cost to the biodiversity footprint. So we looked at how much it would cost if we would, for example, a certain area of land in Finland or, for example, in Brazil, so a little bit two different types of cases. And then we sort of try to, through that proxy, sort of bring the financial value to the biodiversity footprint. And, well, what kind of impact it had? I'd say it seemed like it had quite a big impact on the financial result of the organization. So offsetting the biodiversity footprint might not be cheap. And of course, we don't want it to be cheap. That's maybe the whole point. So if we now look at the biodiversity impact, for example, that our university has, and if we translate that to financial language, it seems that we are not sustainable. So if we would have to offset, for example, our whole biodiversity footprint at the moment, I'm not sure if we would manage to do that. And maybe that tells us that our biodiversity footprint is not on a sustainable level. Perhaps.
So what about like you're talking about offsetting? So are we talking about like investing in carbon credits, or what is the instrument? How are we like offsetting?
Yeah, well, in carbon, yeah, we have those sort of traditional ways of offsetting. So, yeah, buying carbon credits or whatever. In biodiversity field, we don't have a similar system. So it's actually being built in different countries in a little bit different way. So in Finland, we, for example, have a voluntary biodiversity offsetting legislation already in place. And I know that in some other countries we have that as well, but we don't really have a model yet for those offsets. And well, in terms of biodiversity, we have different types of offsets. They can be sort of similar to what is happening in the carbon field, but also a little bit different. So usually they're more based on conserving, for example, land areas or something like that. And maybe just a side note to the offset markets, that I think it's a huge mess at the moment in the carbon offsetting field. And I think it's because there hasn't been good enough regulation and sort of rules in how to do it. So that's why I'm hoping that this sort of biodiversity offsetting field is going perhaps in a little bit better direction, because it started sort of as a regulative and legislative process where we have clear sort of guidelines and rules in how to do credible biodiversity offsetting.
Mm. Do you have an opinion like how should we like approach it? Because if a lot of companies want to become like carbon neutral to reach their goals, they need to do some kind of investing into these kind of credits or offsetting. What would be like a good strategy for that?
Yeah, it is indeed true that I think for very few companies they can actually reach sort of zero emissions without, or net zero emissions without doing some kind of offset. So that is a real issue. Well, first of all, I think, of course, I need to highlight this sort of concept of mitigation hierarchy that is being used. So basically, first of all, we need to find ways to avoid, first of all, the emissions and creating them. Okay, if we cannot avoid them, maybe next level, we can mitigate them. So we can find, for example, alternative technologies in, for example, how we do through them sort of mitigate the carbon emissions. And then finally, if we have sort of thought through all those different steps, we can also think about offsetting. And there are a few good guides to credible offsetting. So credible offsetting has this sort of quality criteria. So we have, for example, the permanence of the offsets. We have the sort of additionality of the offsets, so that the offset would not have happened without that additional funding. We have, for example, principles that they do not make additional social or environmental harm and those sort of things. So I think you can sort of find those different kind of guidelines. And what I would sort of encourage everyone to do is, when you contact, for example, an offsetting provider you're interested in, like, make a checklist, like, are you complying with these quality offset criteria, and see sort of whether they are credible and in responding to those quality criteria. I think that's one way to do it, at least.
And just as a recap, I do my biodiversity accounting. I check what's my impact, and if I couldn't do the offsetting and continue with the work I do, or do it in a zero emission way, then it's not a sustainable business model at the moment.
Well, it's quite tricky. I wouldn't say that necessarily that if you have an impact that you're not sustainable, because, well, we are humans and we depend on our environment, we depend on other species, for example. So we will always have negative impacts. I think there's not going around that. Like that is a fact. But what we should sort of look at is the net impact we have on the environment. So we might have some negative impacts, but can only get balanced by offsets, or, for example, by the good that we do. So what is the good? We have this sort of new concept called handprint as opposed to the footprint. So what is the handprint? So what is the good that our operations have on the society and the environment? But yeah,
I'd say that's really tricky with the handprint, because it depends what you really say, and some companies are afraid to even use the handprint anymore.
Yeah.
What about like, I wanted to also ask you, what do you think about like this reporting scope 4 emissions? It's a bit same, like, do you have an opinion on that?
And that's a new concept actually to me. Could you explain briefly what is a scope 4 emission?
I'm not an expert, full disclaimer. So basically how I understand it, that you're reporting your actions that has avoided, that would have created new emissions. I've done something in my organization or my operations that because of that, it has avoided new emissions.
I see. Okay.
If I get it 100% right, but
yeah.
That was also like claimed as greenwashing and cruel and everything.
Yeah, okay, I see. That's interesting. Actually, that definition that you said, it sounds really close to the definition of this handprint that I mentioned, and I've seen that sort of similar way. And well, I think I wouldn't say it's sort of straight off greenwashing or useless to sort of trying to understand those things and sort of what could be the avoided emissions by our new solutions and stuff. I think it can be worthwhile for sure, but I think where it might get a little bit dangerous and close to greenwashing is if we try to somehow say that, okay, our absolute emissions are now somehow balanced or offset by those scope 4 kind of things that are sort of very indirect. So I think we shouldn't mess up, and we should sort of mix that we have these absolute impacts and these absolute emissions, for example, and then we have some other kinds of things that can be beneficial, yes, but let's not mix them up together so that, people have the right view of things.
And I have to also say that I did a quick Google. So actually scope 4 and the hand footprint, they're the same thing.
Right, yeah.
So that.
Cool.
Yeah, so just wanted to also ask, what do you think of like when we're calculating the environmental accounting and biodiversity accounting, what do you think about the calculations of the like emissions? If it's an electric car, it's zero, so we don't calculate the whole lifespan, but only like the end of it.
I think that is a sort of good example and has been discussed a lot, this sort of electric cars and their batteries and what they produce and all that kind of discussion. And it's actually a sort of good discussion in the sense that it indeed relates to this matter also of carbon footprints and biodiversity footprints, because I think the issue with, for example, just having this sort of carbon tunnel vision is that we tend to then focus on only one environmental aspect, and we sort of are just looking at one of those 5 drivers of biodiversity loss that I mentioned. And that's why the biodiversity footprint, in a sense, I think is a little bit more holistic and takes into account these different things. So it doesn't, for example, leave out the land use or pollution happening in the life cycle of, I don't know, electric car or whatever we're talking about. So it takes all of those things into account, and I think that's the way to go. Of course, I just have to say that whether it's just a carbon footprint or biodiversity footprint, I think we should always have this life cycle perspective when we look at the environmental impacts of different things, whether it's electric car or gasoline car or an energy system or whatever. We need to understand not only what is directly happening in the operations when you drive that car, but we need to understand where did those materials come from and what is the environmental impact of producing all those materials. So this sort of life cycle thinking I think it's very crucial.
And because of that, because of the life cycle thinking, were there changes in the companies that you have studied now because of that biodiversity impact key learnings?
Well, actually, we've compared tag and biodiversity footprints together. I don't know if that straightforwardly answers the question, but maybe at least relates to it a bit. So we have assessed how do different kind of carbon biodiversity footprints compare. So we did, for example, for the city of Tampere, one of the biggest cities in Finland, we did this carbon and biodiversity footprint assessment of their operations, and we saw that, for example, when it comes to their food consumption, the biodiversity footprint seemed to be more relevant than the carbon footprint, which was a little bit smaller. But then again, for example, when we had a look at, say, heat energy consumption, we saw that the carbon footprint seemed to be more important than the biodiversity footprint. And then again, we also saw a lot of synergies. So in different, for example, consumables, the carbon and biodiversity footprints were quite well aligned. So it sort of provided us with quite interesting insights into where we can see some trade-offs. So how do we manage those trade-offs between this climate and biodiversity issue, and where we actually could see joint solutions, so that we can tackle those both things together at the same time.
Okay. So I have to ask about some airlines have this offsetting system. So you pay a little more and you get zero from your flight. You don't get zero, but you get to compensated. So is that an instrument that companies could start creating for themselves? Is that viable?
Well, I think it could be viable, given that of course we have to have credible, for example, offsets. So that's of course a very key thing. If you implement that kind of mechanism, then the offsets that it creates should be sort of, it should abide the quality criteria. Well, again, also I have to say that while I'm sort of not completely against these sort of offsetting schemes, I would also like to maybe steer the focus towards understanding that, if my business now provides this kind of product to the customers, is the core business model and is this product in the first place sustainable and something we sort of truly need in this society when we consider the sort of environmental aspects. So yeah.
Okay, I just got an idea. So if I'm on if I'm on like air company or a trucking company or like this shipping company, and I just say like you can pay a voluntary 5% uh, extra charge, and this is not offsetting, but we're just going to put all the money put here into new equipment. We're going to invest in the future. Could this be a different model, or is it a crazy idea?
No, I don't think it's a crazy idea. Of course, there would have to be quite good sort of assurance that this extra money that is now collected is going
Mm.
into something impactful indeed. But I don't think it's a crazy idea. So I also discussed actually in my dissertation this sort of what I called sort of internal offsetting or in-setting system. It's maybe not based on how I have seen it. It's not necessarily based on, for example, customer relationships, but it's more like an internal system for an organization. So the idea is that we actually put a price on our emissions, for example. So we agree that, for example, okay, we can look at the carbon market prices and say that, if we emit this and that much emissions, this is how much money it should cost. And the idea is that we don't put that money to traditional sort of offsetting providers. So we don't just give the money away to someone who would implement the offsetting project somewhere. But the idea is that we invest it internally to mitigating the footprints. So we invest indeed in sort of, I don't know, for example, renewable energy purchases or something like that. And that's one idea I've been discussing there, but it's still a little bit in the early phases. But just reminded me because it could be a little bit similar to what you proposed there, but just working sort of then with external partners and customers to sort of get the funding sort of for those
Mm.
sustainability investments from them and not so certain, not internally.
Yeah, and it could maybe have companies taking like action for themselves quicker than the general market is like evolving. I could maybe just think of like co-buying maybe electric trucks or equipment that mitigates the emissions on a long run. The only investment you'd have to do is maybe 5 years contract to the traditional 6 months or 3 months or 2 years. Uh,
Sure.
what about what were the challenges when doing your like postdoctorate association?
Well, there are certainly a lot of challenges there, and first of all, maybe if I think about sort of the technical side, is that um, there's the issue of data availability. So that's always a sort of key issue. And many of the people who are involved in sustainability assessments and carbon footprint assessments and biodiversity footprint, they always come up with this. So where do we get good quality data about the company's activities? That is certainly one key challenge in there. Otherwise, I would say that, for example, in this biodiversity impact assessment, the methodologies, they are still in sort of development phase, so we still have a lot of shortcomings there. We cannot, for example, include all of the drivers of biodiversity loss in the assessment. And yeah, there are definitely some other shortcomings there as well. For example, that in many categories the assessment is still based on, for example, monetary consumption rather than basing it on actual sort of physical consumption values.
Mm.
And yeah, writing a dissertation can be fun, but also in the sense that it's a quite a big process in the end. After 4 years, sort of putting that stuff into the one book and trying to think about the things thoroughly there and scientifically, it can be quite a hassle.
Definitely. What's like one thing that if people don't have time to read the 183 pages, like what's like one message that you really want to send them?
Yeah, I would say that break free of the tunnel vision. So I mean by that two things. First of all, we have to look at the environmental sustainability in a broader way. So we have the carbon issues and they are very generally taken into account, but we have to start looking at it more broadly through the biodiversity footprint as well. And the second thing that also relates, I think, to this breaking of the tunnel vision is that the sustainability issues, they are not just sustainability issues. So they are part of and should be part of all the operations and strategies of the organization and the company. Otherwise, there's no use, I think, of those different sustainability things. They have to be somehow embedded and a core part of all our operations.
Great wisdom. One of the previous guests, Robert Chris, had a great quote around sustainability. It was like, what are you trying to sustain? Each culture, each individual has a different perspective on what sustainability is. So it's really important to have like clear communication and to talk it through. So that's something that's been left in my head.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, and I certainly agree with that.
So some of the companies listening to this, people, they're gonna check your book and they're gonna go take action. How do they like start communicating about these things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, first of all, looking at it from a little bit more technical side and then going to sort of more general issues, is that when you start looking at the biodiversity issue, okay, if you cannot do a sort of fancy biodiversity footprint assessment or something like that, right away, I think the key thing there is to understand and communicate that if you remember the 5 key drivers of biodiversity loss, land and sea use, target exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species, you try to understand how does my company, what kind of impacts my company might have in those different spheres, and trying to communicate about those in a current way. I think that's one key thing I would point out. And then the second thing, on a more general level, I would say, if you want to start communicating about these things, I think it's best to be very transparent from the very beginning, because others are also struggling with these issues. It's not a shame sort of to say that we are not there yet and we are on the process and going there. That's okay. But if you try to sort of hide that fact and tell, yay, like we're absolutely great and fine now, then I think greenwashing and all those allegations, they can very easily come in. So I think transparency is very key.
So basically a company could assess those 5 biodiversity categories, tell them out loud publicly, then maybe the community, the buyers could be like, hey, you forgot about that species that's affecting you or something like that, and then you can add them there. So you can basically write negative impact what your company has regarding to the biodiversity out loud publicly. And that's
exactly. Yes, basically just saying out loud that, okay, I might have this kind of land use impacts in my operations. What does it mean? What can we do about it? Okay, I might have this kind of pollution-related impacts in my operations. So how do I acknowledge them? What can I do about it? So that's sort of the process that I'm sort of describing. Acknowledging that we have these sort of issues, we have these different kind of impacts. Everyone has them. What are we going to do about it?
So we're slowly coming to the end of the show. Is there any that I haven't yet asked you that you'd like to answer?
No, No, I think that was basically all. At least it was quite extensive and all that I had in mind. And yeah, maybe just don't be too scared to sort of expand your vision and go to the field of nature and biodiversity. I think that's why we're here, and that's why it matters. It's the life on Earth that we're trying to protect.
Great. Thank you so much, Sami.
Thanks a lot.